I know you will
Between
do
the
top.
two of us,
I
no.
follow you.
No, actually, I think I'm the
Yes.
last.
Oh, hi.
Good afternoon. Please take your seats. The break has been cancelled. This is not exactly the best of time to catch you at your sharpest. Now that I've moved from diplomacy back to academia, I'm often asked, what is the difference between a diplomat and an academic? I wouldn't want to care to speculate on that, but I will say this. The difference between a diplomat and a bureaucrat, I know quite well. A diplomat is somebody who will think twice before saying nothing. A bureaucrat is somebody who will think twice before doing nothing. More seriously now, good afternoon, welcome to this panel on BRICSAM and energy policies. It is often said that we live in an era of very significant and indeed momentous changes. The nature of these changes, however, is often left unspecified and undefined. What I would like to submit to you this afternoon is there are at least two very important ways in which the world is changing these days and is doing so before our very eyes. The first of them is that we are seeing a tectonic change in the origins of economic growth and economic dynamism from the north to what has been referred to as the global south. Mainly, but not only, of course, to China and to India. And let me give you only one example with which I happen to be quite familiar with, which is the case of Chile. Chile's traditional main export market was the United States. Well, this year, this will no longer be so. China will become, this year, Chile's main export market. And as far as Europe's biggest economy, which is Germany, it has been displaced by India as an export market for a country like Chile. And other countries in Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, are following much the same road. The consequences for the interaction between states, for influence, for leverage, are quite obvious and need not detain us here. The second very significant change that we are witnessing, and I think it's become particularly evident in this decade, and we've heard references to it in the course of today's deliberations, has to do with the role of energy. I would argue that the energy issue has become perhaps the main driver of the international agenda, displacing trade, which was perhaps the main driver in the mid to late 90s. Again, the consequences of this are extremely significant. And references were made earlier in the, I think it was in the first panel, to the fact that perhaps it is weak property rights in energy sources that are the source of what is defined as the market failure in having the energy shortages that we have. Well, I would argue that one of the main effects, one of the main implications of having energy as the driver of the international agenda is that energy sources not being a virtual reality but a physical reality, they are located in some territory. They have brought the state back in, as opposed to what we had in the 90s when trade-driven globalization was the main force, in which gave private corporations, private companies the leading role. That is no longer the case. And it seems to me this is very important to keep in mind, because often in the debate on energy, blame is assigned to supposedly ideologically driven and therefore economically inefficient and suboptimal policies for the reason of these market failures, for the reason for these energy shortages. I would argue that is not the case at all. It may be on some particular cases. But the broader issue is a different one. We're seeing a deep structural change in the way states interact with each other because of the role of energy. And we're very lucky to have this afternoon with us 3 leading analysts about 3 of the leading countries in the global south, India, Brazil, and China, who will share with us their views on how each of these giants of the south are taking on the significant question of energy sources, energy policies, energy independence. And we're especially lucky to have with us Dr. Yoginder Alagh, who is a former Minister of Power of India, a university administrator, chairman of the board of a number of very prestigious institutes in India, of Tata Chemicals, and also a columnist for the Indian Express, a column that is very widely read throughout India. So without further ado, let me leave with you Dr. Yoginder Alagh, who has exactly 10 minutes.
Thank you, Jorge. I can see that your partiality towards India has ended with those 10 minutes. If I can just spend 45 seconds on the stories with which Dr. Goria started. I come from a place called the Punjab, which has the highest rate of heart attacks in the world, both in India and in Pakistan. And I always thought it was because we ate mutton every day made in clarified butter. But now I understand it's because we speak English. But the other thing is the story that Jorge mentioned to you. He was Chile's ambassador to India until very recently. I want to tell him that when I was courting a young lady I went to college in America in 1966, that shows you how old I am. She accepted me in a restaurant called La Fonda del Sol, which had just come up, a Mexican restaurant, very close to the Lincoln Center, and it was over a bottle of Chilean wine. And day before yesterday, when I started from Ahmedabad, I ate Chilean apples, which he has exported to India. So it is a small world. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a long paper which is lying outside, and those of you who are interested in India could read that. I will quickly run you through the slides that I have because there is this threat of 10 minutes hanging on my head. India has been developing fast, one of the fastest growing economies in the world, moving over from the 4th largest in purchasing power parity terms to the 3rd largest. But I'm afraid, like the previous speaker from Canada, I have to be very critical of her energy policies. Agriculture and energy have been the soft underbellies of India during the liberalization phase for the last 2 decades. And I'll take you through that story. A stop-go in reform, but made up largely by the fact that the economy was changing over so quickly that it used energy much better. And that is how we were able to manage a high rate of growth with a low growth of capacity in the energy sector and a low growth of production in the energy sector. I want to give you that flavor, and then we will get into the future before I end, unless Jorge stops me. This is India's conventional energy resources. We have 1/6 of the world's population, but only 6% of its hydroelectric potential, and most of it is in the Himalayas. And the good projects are being stopped by the environmentalists, and the bad projects have to be stopped anyway. So there are problems there. We have almost unlimited reserves of coal, which is a point that has been made from the morning, but it is very poor quality coal. We have only 1% of the world's oil and gas reserves. There have been some discoveries recently, but these have not been confirmed as yet. We have very limited quantities of uranium, and that's why we wanted to sign this deal with the Americans, which I hope will come through Anyway, I can see Ramesh is laughing at that. But we have almost unlimited reserves of thorium, where at current levels, if we meet 40% of our energy requirements from nuclear energy, thorium will last us for 3,000 years. So that's almost unlimited. Now, I have a long story on Indian reform, which is there in this paper. I won't go through it. We started a policy towards encouraging private investment in 1991. We had something called the fast track projects, where we ultimately said we will even give you a counter guarantee per rupee of energy that you generate, and it didn't work. My take on that, just before as power minister, I mentioned it to Dr. Manmohan Singh, that the Indian accountant who will give a multinational company a check for not producing power is not born in the government sector. So that policy did not succeed. So we later on had a policy of what we call the big projects, the mega project policy, which were to be negotiated. I mean, it's a long and complicated story. I don't want to get through to it. In brief periods, when we managed the politics well, we had a lot of investment between 96 to 98. Otherwise, it was stop and go, and therefore, we didn't really, this is not the sector where we've done well. We have had an excellent policy, for example, in telecom, in many other sectors, but electricity has been a soft belly, as I said. There were years when we did get a lot of foreign direct investment. We did also get investment in the transmission sector, because those were years when we handled the legal aspects and the legislative aspects well, and those details are there in this paper. But I'll just mention it to you that this stop-go, it cost us fairly heavily. You can see, if you see columns 5 and column 9, that in the decade of the 80s, our capacity growth was 120% approximately. It went down to 60%, which is half of the decade of the 80s and the decade of the 90s. And in this decade, it's been around 25%. And similarly, if you look at electricity generation, in the decade of the 80s, generation was as fast as capacity growth. In the decade of the 90s, generation was faster than capacity growth, and now they're roughly the same. There is a chart which shows this, where you can see that on the steep part of the curve, that's the good performance, where with less capacity your growth was high, and then later on capacity and growth were roughly of the same magnitude, and now that is taking place also. You can ask the question, how did you manage a 9% growth rate? Because India has been growing fast now for almost 25 years with this poor performance in electricity. 3 ways in which we did it. Energy efficiency went up in a very big way. In the morning, there were statistics given to you on energy per $2,000 of GDP in purchasing power parity terms. In terms of kilograms of energy in India, we were close to some of the lowest in the world, 0.14 as compared to, let us say, 15 in Japan, 16 in the United States. No, I'm sorry, 16 in UK was 14. On the other hand, the big energy guzzlers per unit of output have been China, the United States 0.23, 0.22. Canada was mentioned as 0.27 in the morning. The other thing that we did was that production growth was much faster than energy capacity growth, although now since we've reached a kind of limit on plant load factors, I don't think much else is going to come from that. And finally, we allowed people to, which is a horrible way of doing it, to generate their own energy, and that was another way in which we overcame this crisis. Now the chair is threatening me, so I'll get into the future. These are some models which give you how energy intensity in Indian production has been falling in a very big way, and our energy consumption is globally competitive. with some of the best in the world. And this is also true for our public transport sector, municipal waste, and so on. Now, as we grow fast, as productivity of factor use goes up, from around factor productivity going up from about 3 to 5, the main drivers are going to be investment going up from about investment rates of around 30 to about 35%, productivity growth, and larger trade. But how does energy come into this? Now we have basically, this is still on aggregate growth. We have 3 models. This was done for the UN, and given the past, we have both a efficiency scenario and a business as usual scenario. And here you see around 800 million tons of coal in an efficiency scenario, which takes care of a lot of the problems that have been talked about from the morning: fluidites, bed boilers, coal gasification, energy efficiency, and so on. And in a business as usual scenario, you get into something like almost 2 billion tons of coal, which is very, very difficult, and I don't think the world will let us do it. The Swiss and the French have modeled this, and I'm giving you these references if you want to come out with roughly the same story. And now our planning commission, which earlier had given a slightly different forecast, has given this forecast, which is more or less what the first forecast was. The first forecast was done by me and a man called Kirit Parekh, and he's now in the planning commission for the UN. So it's more or less the whole thing. It's only been updated for base year. So this is our latest scenario. What are we going to do about it? The chair is threatening me with notes. I think the energy efficiency part will continue. So that is one way in which we will be at the lower end of the spectrum rather than the unmanageable end of the spectrum. And there we have the record of the last 20 years. We have been one of the more energy efficient economies in the world. We've handled growth that way, and that is going to continue. Technology, coal gasification, and so on is something on which we are very bullish, but as the discussion in the morning showed, it has not as yet reached a stage where the market can take over, and you need a lot of private-public initiatives. And I think Canada, for example, I would suggest to the Canadian associations that, when you are as energy surplus as the Canada is, it becomes very difficult to get into an energy efficient mode. So you should be actually having global programs of cooperation. And Canada should think in terms of the same programs being implemented in India, in China, and so on. I mean, after all, the CANDU reactor was something that we developed with you. Thorium is something that we are going to follow through in a big way. We already have a 45 megawatt experimental nuclear power reactor. We're the only country in the world which generates electricity through the thorium route, and we are now building up a fast breeder reactor. And the economics of it, okay, I'm going, oh, there's 1 minute more. Thank you. Sweetheart, he still loves India. Well, the story of this is that if you take into account some of the things that have been talked about from the morning, transport locations, the cost of transporting fuel, if you also take into account trade in energy sources, then if we are able to repeat in thorium something which we have done with uranium-based reactors earlier, with our fast breeder reactors, if the first one cost 1, the ultimate cost to us was 0.54, and I've given you some of those details in the paper that's out there. If that happens, then in all those locations which are far away from coal in India and where hydropower is not available, thorium-based power, provided we do it well, will be a viable option. And I've given you the numbers there. But if the countries of the world cooperate with us, then instead of doing it over 15 years, we should be able to do it, inshallah, in the next 3 years. Energy efficiency is important. I would also like to say that limiting consumption is an important issue. It's been mentioned in the discussion earlier. The transport energy link, therefore not motor cars, but better transport systems make a big difference to future outcomes in countries like India and China, and also I suspect Brazil. Trade, more open energy, and a more efficient way of managing technology will also make a big difference. And if you model all of this, then India is generating much less of emissions as compared to the horrible scenario. And the trouble with the horrible scenario is not that it's a question of a debate between whether you want more consumption or you don't want more consumption. I was a part of a group which before Rio signed a document which was initiated by Mahbub al-Haq and Shan Trong. And it's quite clear that the world does not exist, taking into account all technological advantages, if India and China, with existing levels of technology, taking into account technological agreements, cross about a quarter of the world's per capita income levels of the OECD countries. So that is simply not a viable path. And if you are not going to let us grow, we are going to raise the question, how can you grow? So the question of lifestyles and the question of sharing of energy and water resources is going to be a real issue which the world will have to resolve in the next 10 years or so. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoginder. We will now have the privilege of having Annette Hester, who was the founding director of the Latin American Center at the University of Calgary. She is an independent energy analyst and consultant and works with many governments and IOs, is affiliated not only with CIGI but with CSIS in Washington, D.C., and with many other organizations. So without further ado, let me leave with you Annette Hester.
Well, hello, good afternoon. This is a great pleasure for me. I've been associated with CIGI from its inception almost, and this is the first time that I get to speak here. And I have to just acknowledge the humongous debt of gratitude to John English for opening a door when others closed. So to John, thank you very, very much. And now fasten your seat belts, wake up everybody. Let's take a trip to the south, and I want to bring Brazil into the bigger context of the Western Hemisphere and sort of link it to Canada, because in truth, compared to India and China, Brazil is neither a big, huge consumer, neither is a big producer. So why is it Brazil important? So we have talked about this morning, we have worldwide consumption growing inside of, I made that comment this morning, of this insatiable U.S. appetite for 25% of the world resources, 20 million barrels a day. China also growing consumption. In the meantime, increasing production is harder to get, more expensive. China becoming more and more dependent on foreign sources. And the U.S., which is also a big producer, becoming increasingly concerned and increasingly an importer of energy. The consequence, the result, look at the price of oil, and we've gone up to $90. And I have averages all the way up to 2006, and they are expressed in 2006 dollars, just to give you a way to compare. So it's not surprising everybody is talking about energy security, or let's say energy insecurity. So the U.S. is obviously very concerned. It's not surprising. They consume a lot. They do very little on the demand side, and in spite of all their talk about Middle East, they actually are dependent on the Western Hemisphere for over 50% of their energy needs. The Middle East corresponds to maybe something like 16% only, and out of the 16%, 11% is Saudi Arabia alone. So for the US, we have Canada, which is the supplier extraordinaire. But we have huge challenges, as we heard all morning, about increasing production. We have Mexico as the second producer, and Mexico also is facing huge challenges of, unfortunately, its own making. But production in Mexico is declining, and reversing this trend is going to take a great deal of work and consensus among Mexican society. But the biggest field in Mexico, from 2 million barrels a day, Cantarell, from 2 million barrels, it's, I think production is at 1.49 or something like that. So it's already in decline. Venezuela, what can I say about Venezuela other than it's unpredictable? The best that we can say is that Mr. Chavez is looking for other markets. He's constrained by refining capacity, but as soon as he's got other refiners and other markets that he can sell to, he will sell. So the U.S. has a bit of a problem on its hands. But in this scenario of, let's say, instability or in the Western Hemisphere, here comes Brazil as one of the principal strategic actors in a new energy political equilibrium in the Americas. So it's surprising to see Brazil with sort of strategic needs that are more in line with Canada and the U.S. than with its Latin American partners and neighbors, which is a very different position for Brazil. Brazil, what can you say about Brazil? And I can say that Brazil, energy security has been a preoccupation of Brazil for a very long time, and much longer than it has been a preoccupation for the U.S. Brazil in the 70s basically got itself in a knot because it was not a producer, it didn't have supplies, and it needed to face, the high oil prices. So what does it do in the midst of what was a dictatorship and very much of Brazil love it or leave it, which was the big signs everywhere in Brazil? The military dictators went out to find American expertise and started a whole new program in deep water drilling. And today, Brazil is a leader on deep water drilling. He believed in Petrobras, the Brazilian national oil company, and an extremely pragmatic company. And we'll have the honor of listening to one of its former CEOs tomorrow, Philippe Heistu, who basically, during his tenure, internationalized and brought Petrobras into a really modern, international, forward-looking company. And used its expertise of the pro-alcohol program of the 1970s and reformed sort of its all-ethanol production to be a very, very efficient, very productive, very efficient ethanol producer, completely unlike what you see in the U.S. and corn. And Philippe will talk much more about it tomorrow. But with ethanol, you have the producers with power. It's not really, it's private production. You have flex fuel vehicles, and you still have bottlenecks, but those are all being resolved. And what happens in Brazil is that compared to what we see in Canada, what the minister said today, that we have 0.5% of renewables in our energy matrix, Brazil happens to have 44% of renewables in the energy matrix. So now, thanks to ethanol in transportation, to hydropower, to a combination of all of those elements, it emerges as a very balanced energy matrix that maybe Brazil isn't growing so fast, but maybe Brazil is setting everything up so that it can grow in a much more balanced way. There's something to be said about that. I think we should think about it. The opportunities. While you have a Petrobras, which is a mixed capital company, Okay, 2 minutes. I'm going to run through this. World leader in deep water, world leader in biofuels transport, possible benchmark for mixed capitals. And when we're talking about production this morning, I want to note that before you have a lot of options as a company to go out and explore somewhere. These days, over 70% of the world resources are in the hands of national oil companies or have some kind of restriction for public-owned companies. So it has a diversification in matrix which can be sustainable, and it is a world leader in production of biofuel and the management of production. The challenges: Brazil has difficulties ahead in reconciling the conflicting interests of a mixed capital company. The government, and especially the Lula government, has great tendencies of wanting to do public policy through Petrobras, but it is, after all, mixed capital. It wants Petrobras as an active actor in the biofuels market, and sometimes I think in sort of stepping on the toes of the private producers. But the diversification in the energy matrix has challenges, especially if it's forced to grow too fast in terms of predatory growth, perhaps not for ethanol itself, but substitution of crops, especially in the Amazon basins. And in biofuels, there are serious labor and social issues that are being addressed but are being raised. And finally, what could Brazil be? Well, Brazil has every possibility to be an example of responsible energy development in dealing with the energy diversity in a true sustainable way, with Petrobras becoming a true benchmark of what a state oil company can be, in a world that you don't transfer technology, that government and private public-private partnerships also mean that governments do retain some ownership, and you develop technology together, you don't transfer it, and that you actively promote a global environmental certification standard that is neutral and encompasses all energy sources. And if that was the case, then Brazil, instead of being the country of the future forever, would be the country of the present. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Annette, for a very comprehensive presentation on Brazil's energy situation and energy policy. And we will now have Dr. Wenran Jiang, who is an Associate Professor of Political Science and Acting Director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta, a Senior Fellow of the Asia-Pacific Foundation, and is also Vice President of the Canadian Association of Asia-Pacific Security. Dr. Jiang.
Thank you, Chairman. I would like to thank the Professor John English and Cooper from CIGI to invite me to come to share my views with you about China's energy issues. And China, let me emphasize, ladies and gentlemen, if we talk about a global, worldwide, sustainable energy future, China is the 800-pound gorilla you have to deal with. It is not to diminish the significance of India or Brazil, but China very much will define what kind of future that we will have in terms of a sustainable global supply of energy and use. And I particularly like the plural form of the conference theme, that what kind of futures. If China, together in the near future with India, if they do not adopt important policy adjustments on energy use, I think the energy sustainable future will be very, very bleak for the entire world. So let me go through just a few points here. I have 10 minutes to illustrate my point. One is about China's moment of truth on energy consumption. To give you a little bit of the indexed numbers and statistics. And number two, I want to have a quick look at how China is searching for a sustainable energy future, just like we're talking about around the world, and finally, what it means to Canada and to the rest of the world, and what kind of strategic choices China and the rest of the world have to make in order to make a sustainable energy future actually possible on the bright side. Okay, we often talk about China in the past few years, we all know, as a thirsty dragon. Thirsty just about for everything, especially thirsty for oil. They're scalding the earth around the world to secure energy supply, to lock up the energy fields. China is the ultimate, source of high oil prices and so on and so forth. So, how thirsty is the thirsty dragon? That's the first question. Number two, why China? We assume China consumes a lot of energy, and yet we have to know the numbers. Why China consumes so much at this particular moment? And finally, what is the global context if you put all the China's consumption figures together? Okay, let me skip all this just to refresh your memory. China consumes a lot of energy today because China has gone through nearly 3 decades of explosive economic growth at nearly 10% per year on average. And on the energy area, you can see China is the second largest energy consumer, and also, some people do not know, the second largest energy market and the second overall energy producer. And to note the trend here, China used to produce a lot more GDP with less energy, but that, by the turn of the century, turned into the other way around. China now consumes more energy and produces less GDP in terms of efficiency. And as a result, China turned in 1993 from a pure oil exporter to an importer and has never turned back. And especially in recent years, it has consumed more and more. India, we talked about where India is in comparison with China. In terms of demand, China is way ahead. India is following, and look at the oil consumption where China and India in the world. So China is significantly ahead. And number two, China consumes a lot of energy and oil and so on and so forth is because of its current industrial structure is heavy industry oriented, and China consumes so many percentages of so many materials. I'm not going to go through this one by one. And that heavy industrial structure will not change significantly in the coming decades. Okay, the Chinese like to use this reverse U-curve theory on income inequality, even on climate change, also on energy use. Say, well, we're now using more energy. Well, we industrialize. When we industrialize, our energy consumption will drop. We don't know, because in the next few decades, that is not going to be the picture. So the total oil consumption is also growing because China has a huge appetite for automobiles, and the transportation is taking 40% and more, until China is marching towards more and more like a Western industrializing country's consumption pattern in terms of energy. And number three, China does not use energy efficiently. Very wasteful in many ways. So China, a typical advanced developing country, consumes 3.3 or more on average than global average in producing every unit of GDP, and performing much worse in comparison with other industrialized countries in terms of efficiency. So more demands in terms of energy and the oil import dependency, and the future for import dependence will grow substantially in the future. And yet, in the global context, got 3 minutes left, this is quick. In the global context, we see some people say China imports about nearly 7 million barrels of oil. That's not true. China consumes that much because China primarily produces about 60% of its oil. It's the volatility of Chinese oil demands that drives the world market in a very volatile manner. But on a total consumption basis, China is still about 6%, and the United States is here about a quarter of the world's consumption. And in terms of per capita, you know where China is and where the other heavy consumers are. So in terms of electricity consumption, vis-a-vis the Human Development Index, you see China is still very low. And the next chart, the correlation between per capita GDP, per capita electricity consumption, and per capita income, you see where China it is going towards in the future. So it is, at the moment, China's overall dependency on foreign energy is still limited because of its energy structure, and it consumes a lot of coal, but the United States is a lot more vulnerable in that sense. But nevertheless, China is going up there in terms of energy consumption and demand. Well, number two, quickly, China's search for sustainable energy future. They identified these bottlenecks and they tried to solve it. And China's energy structure here, note, is 60%, over well, close to 70%, depending on the coal. That will not change in the coming decades. And the energy mix here is very, very twisted in comparison with what just presented in the case of Brazil. And so assuming China now is primarily burning coal, and they want to diversify, and they want to have more production, and they want to go into conservation, and of course they want to go out around the world as well. They have potential themselves, but China is going around, I go through this quickly. China is also going around the world trying to secure in different parts of the world on its energy supply. So as a result of the going out strategy, China's imports of energy, oil primarily and gas, changed from early 90s to early 2000. If you look at these more diversified countries, many of them are not friendlier towards Western countries, especially not friendly toward the United States. When Venezuela is coming up to become a big supplier, China now going up very significantly with Africa, now supplying 30% of China's imports. Middle East, by far going very fast. And so you have numbers I will distribute to you. China roughly imports mostly from the Middle East and then Africa, growing from Central Asia, and about 5–6% in Latin America. And all of these Asian countries depend strategically on Middle East and Africa very significantly. And finally, number 3 point, strategic choices. I think China is not primarily cumulatively responsible for global warming, but you can see China is catching up with the United States as the largest, in the next couple of years, to be the largest emitter of CO2. And these are primarily because of China's heavy use in the coal. And you can meet all the targets about Kyoto, but if China continue to set up its coal power energy plant, India and the United States, we will not be able to meet any targets. And that's the reality we're looking at. So, strategic choices, what do we do? It comes down to a few things about how to deal with the dragon. And we have opportunities as well on China as a major market. Of course, Canada might have a role to play. Alberta is the second largest oil reserve. And what we can do, we're supplying largely to the United States because our production is up, US production is down, and we're exporting to the United States a lot. But if Enbridge proposed gateway pipeline is going to go into the West Coast, which is on suspense now, this might be a future for Canada to export oil towards Asian market, especially China. Because strategically we see around the world the strategic choking points of those straits are very, very strategically important for the future of oil shipping. And China has a particular Malacca dilemma, as we call it. 80% of China's imports coming through the Strait of Malacca, coming from the Middle East and Africa. So how to solve that problem? And Canada may have something strategically to contribute. That is, Alberta government study showed the potential export actually can reduce passage through the Strait of Malacca substantially in the future. And maybe we can think of outside of the box on some of these issues regarding China. At the end of the day, I think we need to make strategic choices. Are we going to deprive China of its use for energy in the future for its own development? Or we're going to work with China on environmental issues, on energy-related issues, make strategic choices, and then we can have a brighter future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jiang, for your very detailed and comprehensive presentation again. I will now open the floor for questions. I will ask you to identify yourselves over here, please, and then ask as brief a question as possible.
Thank you, Ali Mafi Nezam with the Mosaic Institute. My question is for Dr. Alagh and Jiang on how you see the relationship between China and India and the Persian Gulf and Caspian Sea regions in general, and most specifically the gas pipeline that India has been discussing with Pakistan and with Iran over the past few years that's meant to take gas from the South Pars field, especially in light of the fact that gas is a cleaner fuel. I'm wondering if you could share your general ideas about that.
Very good. Yoginder.
We have very great strategic interests in Central Asia and West Asia. We, of course, China also has a lot of interest in that region. We helped in building the road network so that energy and material goods can be evacuated from countries like Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and so on through Bandar Abbas to link up with the trade with us. And the energy pipeline is of very great importance to us, and we are pursuing that in a very dedicated manner. Largely, the Indian strategy has been that the ONGC, which is our parastatal in oil sector, has been helping many of the countries of Central Asia and West Asia in oil exploration. And then when oil finds are there, we get a share for development. This has happened in Iran. More such projects are on the pipeline, and in the other West Asian countries, and also with Central Asia. But we are also looking at energy links with the East, gas particularly from Burma going up to particularly offshore gas, and that has to be evacuated through Bangladesh. And the more important thing is that the north and the west of India are the energy guzzlers. So we are going to be short there. So this energy is going to play a very, important role, not very important role. It'll still be less than about 10 to 15%, even if one assumes very optimistic trade of our total requirements, but it'll be important to us.
Dr. Jiang?
Well, the Chinese summarized their global strategy in securing its oil and gas supply with 4 Chinese words recently. It's called Nanchuan Beiguan. That means tankers coming from the south, pipelines coming from the north. Coming from the north primarily, now Kazakhstan, already one pipeline going through, gas line. They're securing, fighting with Japan to secure Russia's building pipeline, and China put in $70 to $100 billions in Iran to develop oil and gas field. China has secured 30 to 40-year gas and oil contract agreements with Australian government, which is a conservative government, but proudly announced the largest deal in Australian trade history. It is to secure a long-term supply, talking about $30 to $40 billion supply to China. So therefore, China is going through this rapid development of oil and gas imports and building along the coastal city lines all the LNG terminals, and it is very, very big because the natural gas element in China's energy mix is only about 2%, very low in comparison with global average. So that's where they're trying to work on.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Jiang. Yes, over there. Sorry, here. It's here.
Robert Lafrance, Bank of Canada. Two questions. One for...
Can you speak up, please?
Yes. It's a question of distance. I'm not a rock star yet. One question for Ms. Hester about the sustainability of biofuels. Brazil is very impressive in the percentage of its energy mix that comes from these resources. But in the big picture, is the exploitation of these types of resources, say, destroying the Amazon's ability to absorb carbon, or what's the net carbon effect or emission of greenhouse gases of using these renewable resources? And my second question is for Dr. Jiang. We've looked at China's energy consumption. We're a little bit more optimistic, hoping that China follows, say, Korea and Japan in the sense that as its per capita GDP increases, then its energy intensity use will fall for two reasons. One, it will be using better technology, and second, there will be a very strong demand to reduce pollution. As you mentioned, 16 of the world's most polluted cities are in 20th most polluted cities are in China. So how do you what do you think about that?
Thank you very much. Annette?
Yeah, I'll be really brief on that because you'll have a much more comprehensive talk from Mr. Reichtel tomorrow on biofuels in Brazil. But just to say that Brazil has an enormous amount of arable land. So there is a lot of room to grow without getting even close to the Amazon. But that's not to say that there hasn't been some pressures and substitutions that substituting crops that were somewhere and could move to the Amazon or have moved, or that there are certain pressures. So it's not to deny that there are pressures, but it doesn't have to be as long as there isn't this incredible rush. I guess it's the same thing as in Canada when you have this incredible pressure to grow fast, and things happen that are unintended, and there isn't the time to sort of grow slowly. But Brazil does have the arable land available to grow a lot of food, a lot of biofuels, without impinging in the Amazon at all.
Dr. Jiang?
Yes. I think there are two elements I would identify that makes it very difficult for China to follow the path of either Japan or South Korea. The first element is the basic fact of globalization and the global distribution of production bases. China is the factory of the world in a sense. We don't produce refrigerators, air conditioners anymore. China produces them. And we subcontract. China, more than 60% of China's exports are actually produced, contracted by the foreign multinationals, especially the American ones. They simply move their production base to China. Just last week in Vancouver, we had a conference. We have a colleague from India saying, well, India will not follow China's path because you know what? We have a better service industry. We don't produce refrigerators and all that stuff. We're going to service industry. Well, the question is where the refrigerators they're using are coming from. They're produced in China. So the question now is, we produce everything in China and we buy them, and then we turn around saying, hey, you pollute the world. Hey, you emit too much CO2. But actually, that's our share of the problem, isn't it? So therefore, we produce there, China is sharing that burden, number one. Number two, China has a huge population base. Simple mathematics, let me just refresh your memory. The United States now, with about 5% of the world's population, consumes about a quarter of the world's oil supply daily. China has more than 1/5 of the world's population, consumes about 6% of the world's oil supply daily. So China has roughly 4 times of US population. If on per capita basis, every Chinese, 1.3 billion of them, consume on a per capita basis, like every American, China alone will need over 80 million barrels of oil, and that's the daily supply
Of the world.
Of the world. And that's not sustainable. We're not talking about changing lifestyles here at all. And the Chinese basically have come to a conclusion after extensive debate, I mean, the World Bank State Council joint report was out, which I participated last year. After 2 days debate, they have no way out. They say we cannot reproduce what the Western countries are doing. Basically, the only way out for China to also enjoy a good life in the future, also to sustain itself, is technological leapfrogging. You can't do it the old way, but how do you achieve that? Technology leapfrogging, China cannot do it alone because it doesn't have those technologies or have very little of it. So therefore, we're stuck at a very, very crucial moment, and somebody has to think outside of the box about China and about India and about all these coming other developing countries.
Thank you. We have also run out of time. We're not only running out of fuel, but also out of time. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists for these illuminating presentations.